Hello, welcome to the Maya Toolbelt. This is Michael. Today we're going to talk about a deformer. There's lots of different deformers in Maya, but this one we're going to talk about is the lattice. Let me create a sphere to demonstrate. So with my sphere selected, I'll go into the animation menu set here, animation, create deformers, lattice. So you'll see it creates a cage around my geometry. And what this cage does is it allows me to manipulate the geometry in a very free-form way, almost like I'm sculpting it out of clay. So it manipulates lots of different points, all within these quadrants that this cage is made up of. If I were to select the bottom row, all the effectiveness of this lattice will be strictly from this edge of the lattice down to this edge within this quadrant, this cube. So anything I do down here will not affect the geometry within this quadrant of the cube. If I were to select this edge here, it will affect both quadrants because I'm adjusting both quadrants' shape. You can see here with the lattice I can do very broad strokes changes to a piece of geometry without having to literally go in here and manipulate every single little vertex this sphere had to get this kind of shape. So if you're wanting to start with a sphere or whatever kind of shape you're starting with and just kind of work it into place, into a basic form, a lattice is a good way to start. So how does the lattice work? Let me undo back to before we started messing with it. So my lattice is around my sphere. Over here on the right side you have your division options, and by default there's 5 divisions making up 4 vertical quadrants, but you can increase this easily and also increase the depth of the quadrants within as well. Now the more quadrants you get, the more fine-tuned control you'll get, but also it'll get pretty dense pretty soon, and eventually you'll be like, why don't I just mess with my sphere to begin with? So I typically try to keep it as generic as I can and as few quadrants as I can to get the kind of look I'm going for. So probably wouldn't go any more dense than this, relatively speaking, but we'll just keep it easy for what we're demonstrating now. So over here on the outliner that I have open on the left, you'll see that when I created the lattice, it also created a base. You have the lattice here, and then if I click, it'll show the base. Now by default, the base is invisible until you select it. And the base is simply just a cube or a square around the geometry that I applied the lattice to. So the way lattice works is it calculates the distance between the lattice points and the base points. So if I were to grab this point here and move it this way, you'll see it stretches the geometry out that way. If I select the base is still square. So what these points are doing is it's calculating the distance between these areas to result in this sort of deformation. If you were to grab the base and rotate it, you'll see that it affects the geometry. Yeah, let me turn this on so you can see it. It affects the orientation of the sphere, but the actual deformation is not moving because that calculation still is the same. It's just where it is happening on the sphere is changing because I'm rotating that base around. You can see the pole of the sphere down here. Let me hide the grid. As I rotate this, that pole is moving, but the geometry deformation effect remains stationary. Undo all that. And vice versa, if I were to select the lattice and rotate it, it's rotating the entire sphere around because the entire sphere is being manipulated because of all these points. But that deformation goes with the lattice is what I was trying to say, because that point over here is what's causing this change, and it is rotating along with everything else. I can select just this top row of lattice points and then rotate them, and it will affect it like this. So with the lattice in place, what happens if you move the sphere? Let me do a little bit more to the lattice to have a bit more drastic effect. There we go. So if I select the sphere now and move it out of the lattice, you'll see that it immediately reforms into the original sphere. That lattice only affects it if the sphere is within the boundaries of the lattice by default. One thing that's kind of cool about this is you can kind of get the, and let me move this point over and more closely get what I'm talking about here. If you wanted to have an object flowing through a pipe, for instance, you could create a deformer along the row of the pipe, have the object pulled out of the deformer, and then animate it going through the deformer to create this kind of effect of an object being pulled through a volume that's manipulating the shape. Very cool. Let's go back. Now let's look at some of the options that lattices have. Oh, and by the way, if you select the lattice and just hit delete, the base will also be deleted and the sphere will go back to normal. Let's look at the options of the lattice now. With my original sphere, I'm going to create deformers, lattice, options. Let's edit, reset, make sure I'm at my default. So first, to get divisions, that's with the same thing I was showing you down here in the channel box. It just changes how dense the lattice is. Let's go down here to positioning and turn the grid on, just so you know where the center point of the grid is. By default, positioning is center around selection, which simply means that when I apply a lattice, it automatically will grow and into size and scale based on how big the object is. If I undo that, uncheck this, center around selection, hit apply. Now my lattice just is created in a default position at the center of the world, still affecting my sphere, but no longer as big as my sphere. And if I move it, you can see it's whatever points happen to be within it are affected. So we'll undo that, turn this back on, because I think centering around the selection makes it the most useful. Now, group base and lattice together, you'll notice when I was doing it before, I hit apply, when I can rotate the lattice and the base stays where it is. I can rotate the base and the lattice stays where it is. Undo all that. Group base and lattice together and hit apply. You'll see in the outliner here I have my sphere, but now I have my lattice group, and within that group is the lattice and the base. So if I select that entire group and rotate it, the base and the lattice are both being rotated at the same time. So instead of having to select them both to rotate them if you need to, you can simply select the group, which it can be handy. Undo all that. Uncheck this for now. Parenting, auto parent to selection. This will simply parent the lattice to the object. So with this turned off, and I hit apply, and let's just mess with this lattice to get something to happen. When I move the sphere, out of the lattice, it becomes a sphere again until I get it back in the lattice and it takes effect. Undo all that. With parenting turned on, and I hit apply, and let's manipulate the lattice to get something to happen. Now when I select the sphere and move it, the lattice automatically, along with the base, is parented to the sphere. So the sphere brings the lattice along with it whenever you move it. Undo all that. So that's parent, auto parent to selection. Uncheck that for now. Now freeze geometry mapping. This is a little hard to explain, but I'll again just show you without it being checked. Freeze mode not checked, and hit apply. I can move the geometry outside the lattice. I can scale my sphere. I can rotate my sphere, and you can see it all happening. If I turn freeze geometry mapping on and apply, and I'll make the lattice do something. There we go. So now when I select my sphere and try to move it, you can see my sphere's pivot point's way over here. I'm moving it, but it's actually not being moved from the lattice. The lattice has frozen the sphere in place as far as the lattice is concerned. I can scale my sphere, rotate my sphere, and you can see the numbers over here in the channel box changing. It's actually doing something, but because that geometry mapping is frozen, it's just not showing since the lattice is applied. If I were to delete the lattice, you can see that all that scaling and rotating actually did happen. It just was being hidden from view because of that freeze option. That's freeze geometry mapping. I'll uncheck that. So now we have our outside lattice selection here, and there's a couple different options. Transform only if inside lattice is the default option, which we've seen that a couple of times now, where if you hit apply and do something with the lattice and move the sphere out, it literally will only take effect when it gets within this lattice point. You can see all these points of geometry just snapping into position as they enter the lattice's field of influence, making for a very choppy transition. Let me undo all that and choose a different option. Instead of transform only if inside, let's try transform all points. Hit apply. I'll do something here. Let's make it do this. So now whenever I move it, you can see that whatever I've done to the lattice, it's still affecting the geometry. And not only is it still affecting it, it's affecting it from here. If I were to adjust these points with the geometry fully outside of the lattice's bounds, it still affects it. And it's affecting it from this point of origin. So if I were to move the lattice, it moves the object. If I were to move the base, the object starts warping around based on the base's position in relation to the lattice. Undo all that. So that was transform all points. Now let's try the third option, transform if within fall off. And when I have that option chosen, a fall off distance modifier also lights up. It's grayed out without this option being chosen. So I choose this. I'll leave fall off distance at 1 for now. Hit apply. Do something with my lattice to make something happen. Now if I move the object out, you can see at a certain point it becomes my sphere again. It's no longer being influenced by the lattice, but when it gets close enough, you can see right there it starts to dimple in. When it starts getting close enough, it takes the lattice's influence back into account until you get all the way into it, and then as I exit out, it starts to kind of bleed away. And so with that influence fall off set at 1, this is the distance we get. Let me undo. Let's say a fall off distance of 0.1, much smaller fall off. Hit apply. Let me do something here. Make like a mushroom shape. It's still kind of a drastic, probably because the influence is so small, it's affecting it pretty drastically. But let me do something, there we go, a little bit more subtle. You can kind of see that kind of magnet effect of the geometry being pulled toward the lattice as it gets close enough. And if I were to kind of go at an angle at it here, you can see what happens with the geometry. So that's with the fall off of 0.1. So I have one more thing to show you about lattices. We've gone through pretty much all the options. There are a few things like advanced, talking about deformation order. I feel like deformation order probably could use a video of its own to explain, and it goes for all deformers, not just the lattice. So whenever I do talk about it, it will apply to all deformers. So don't worry about that for now. I'll just reset my settings to get back to my default lattice, create, and I'll do something with the lattice to make something happen. Whenever it squeezes in, it's a little bit more fun to look at. So I have this lattice here. I can move my sphere out of it, just like the default options, and it can kind of flow through like the pipe analogy. But let's say I want to duplicate this sphere and have another one that does it. See, my duplicate is not affected by the lattice, but my original one is. How can I make this sphere be affected by the same lattice? Do I need to create a new lattice and try to kind of mimic the first one? Oh, that would be such a hassle. Believe me, there is a way that you don't have to worry about that. Go to Window, Relationship Editors, Deformer Sets. This brings up the Relationship Editor window here, and because we're talking about deformer sets, on the left side it shows all my deformers, which in this case is this one, and on the right side all of the objects in my scene. By default, not by default, but at the moment, this lattice is affecting P-Sphere 1, the very first sphere I made. Also in this list, though, is P-Sphere 2, my duplicate. If I just click it and highlight it and move my second sphere up, now it is also being affected. So using this relationship editor, you can actually uncheck P-Sphere 1, so now my original sphere is no longer affected. So you can pick and choose which objects in your scene are affected by your deformers, even after you've initially applied it to one. I can create a, let's do a cylinder, for example. And over here in my relationship editor, choose my cylinder, highlight it in the objects side of the screen so that now it will also be affected by my lattice. Let me move my sphere out of the way. There we go. So very quickly, any lattice can affect any geometry thanks to the relationship editor. And I think that's a pretty thorough look at lattices. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. If I've forgotten anything, definitely let me know. I'll make an addendum video to this. Like, comment, subscribe. I really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed this video. My name is Michael, and this has been the Maya Toolbelt. See you next time.